Have the Seattle Seahawks done enough to help Russell Wilson? That's kind of the question that every Seattle Seahawks fan has been asking themselves for the last 5 years, every single offseason. And every fan has their own perspectives and opinions on whether or not the Seahawks have. However, as we go into 2020 and we are a handful of months from what we hope will be a season, there seem to be two things that are relatively indisputable and a vast majority of fans would agree on. Number one, the Seahawks have done a fantastic job of building a deep, talented, and possibly even elite core of tight ends. We have some questions about them. There are some injury concerns. There are some age concerns. We need to see it on the field for a little bit before we know for sure. But as of right now, it really seems like the Seahawks have done a great job building one of the best tight end groups in all the NFL. And that's something that Willson has never had. However, the flip side of that is while we do have a couple of really good wide receivers who I think pretty much all Seahawks fans like, the receiver core is thin, it's shallow, it's very susceptible to an injury or two, and overall you would say it's probably not very good. And that's something that the Seahawks haven't really had a problem with in quite some time. So my question is, before we answer the question of have we done enough to help Russell Wilson, my question really is, are we going to be able to utilize the talent that we have? Is there a way to maximize the potential output of our elite tight ends and minimize the impact of a shallow and thin receiver core? That is the question I'm going to try to answer in this video. And by the end, hopefully, we have some idea of how the Seahawks can utilize their tight ends and whether or not they will actually be able to, while also masking their weakness at wide receiver. First, let's familiarize ourselves with what the Seahawks currently have at tight end and how it compares to what they've had in previous seasons. I've assembled a list of players and seasons that those players have played. In order to make this list, you had to fulfill two criteria. One, you had to be a tight end for the Seattle Seahawks between the years of 2012 and 2019. And two, you had to catch at least 5 passes during a single regular season. This second criteria meant that a handful of names that would have otherwise been here fell off, so with apologies to Evan Moore, Kellen Davis, Chase Kaufman, George Fant, Nick Vannett ×2, and Tyrone Swoops ×2, we just had to leave them off this list. However, for the sake of this study, please note that none of these players, with the exception of Nick Vannett, would go on to accomplish anything of even a minuscule impact in the NFL after they left Seattle. When Russell Wilson first joined the Seahawks in 2012, they had a well-established veteran at the tight end position in the form of Zach Miller. Zach had been very productive and even made a Pro Bowl during his years in Oakland, but he never found that sort of production again after joining the Seattle Seahawks. All in all, in Wilson's first season in the NFL, Zach Miller managed an efficient and effective, but not particularly notable, 38 receptions on 53 targets for 396 yards and 3 touchdowns. The only other tight end to make any sort of impact on the 2012 Seattle Seahawks was Anthony McCoy, who caught 18 balls on 28 targets for 291 yards and 3 touchdowns. Anthony McCoy would never catch an NFL pass after this season. Although he would roster a couple of times in following years, he was never again so much as targeted on an NFL pass. In 2013, things were largely the same. Zach Miller was still the featured tight end in the offense, and he caught 33 passes on 56 targets for 387 yards and 5 touchdowns. Missing 2 games due to injury during the course of the season, Zach Miller was also noticeably less efficient this year as a pass catcher. However, it has to be said that this is probably the 4th best season any tight end has ever had with Russell Wilson. The only other tight end of note in the offense this year would have been Luke Willson, a rookie who caught 20 passes on 28 targets for 272 yards and a touchdown. 2014 was the first season in Wilson's career where this position would undergo significant changes. Zach Miller once again started the year as the primary tight end in the offense, But in game number 3, he would suffer a career-ending injury after just 6 catches on 7 targets for 76 yards. It cannot be denied that Zach Miller was a very effective player in Seattle. He was an excellent blocker at the tight end position, which enabled a lot of the things that they wanted to do during that era. However, it has to be said that Zach Miller played a grand total of 33 regular season games with Russell Wilson as his quarterback and tallied less than 1,000 total receiving yards across those games. In any case, Luke Willson became the featured tight end in the offense after Zach went down. And while Willson was able to build on his rookie season success with 22 catches for 362 yards and 3 touchdowns, he also needed 40 targets to do it, becoming a noticeably inefficient option. Luke would also miss 1 game this year to injury. At this point, the Seahawks needed a new backup tight end, and that came in the form of Cooper Helfet, who caught 12 passes on 24 targets for 185 yards and 2 touchdowns. Also making an impact this season at the backup tight end position was Tony Moeaki, who caught 8 of his 13 targets for 134 yards and a touchdown. As for Moeaki, well, he would latch on with the Atlanta Falcons the following season and catch 3 passes before retiring from football forever. The position underwent a seismic change in 2015 when the Seahawks traded for Pro Bowler Jimmy Graham from the Saints. Jimmy Graham ended the 2015 season with 48 catches on 74 targets for 605 yards and 2 touchdowns. He would go on to miss the last 5.5 games due to an injury that ended his season. Despite missing the last 5.5 games, it has to be said that Jimmy Graham's 2015 is the 3rd best season any tight end has had with Willson, and it's not particularly close. Backing Jimmy Graham up this year were 2 familiar faces. Luke Willson caught 17 balls on 26 targets for 213 yards and a touchdown, missing 2 games due to an injury on the way. The only other tight end to make a big impact this year was Cooper Helfet, who hauled in 13 passes on 22 targets for 130 yards. Cooper would retire after the 2015 season and never play professional football again. Things were a little different in 2016. Jimmy Graham was back from his injury, played a full season, and not only did he post the greatest season any tight end has ever put up with Russell Wilson, he also put up the greatest season any tight end has had in Seahawks franchise history. All in all, Jimmy brought in 65 catches on 95 targets for 923 yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. The only other tight end to make any real impact on the 2016 Seahawks was once again Luke Willson, who caught 15 balls on 21 targets for 129 yards and 2 touchdowns, also missing 5 games. 2016 remains the only season in Wilson's career where his tight ends collectively broke 1,000 receiving yards. Unfortunately, by 2017, the party was largely over. Jimmy Graham was not the same player anymore and was no longer much of a threat between the 20s. He did manage to turn himself into an elite red zone receiving threat and hauling in 10 receiving touchdowns over the course of a full 16-game season, but at the end of the day, Jimmy Graham's 57 catches on 96 targets for a mere 520 yards is well below the standards he established for himself in his prime. Nevertheless, due to all the touchdowns, this is probably the 2nd best season any tight end has ever had with Russell Wilson. Jimmy Graham ultimately played 3 seasons with Russell Wilson, and he posted at least 500 receiving yards in all 3 of those seasons. To date, no other tight end has broken 400 receiving yards in a single season playing with Wilson. Providing support for Jimmy Graham were Luke Willson, 15 catches on 22 targets for 153 yards and 4 touchdowns, and Nick Vannett, 12 catches on 15 targets for 124 yards and a touchdown, missing 1 game to injury. 2018 established a new low for the position. Ed Dickson was brought in before the season and was intended to be the primary tight end in the offense, but he was injured and missed the first 6 games, and even after he came back was clearly not able to take on the lead tight end responsibilities. Ultimately, across 10 games, Ed Dickson could only catch 12 passes on 13 targets for 143 yards and 3 touchdowns. In practice, the main tight end in the offense for most of the year was Nick Vannett, who responded with a respectable 29 receptions on 43 targets for 269 yards and 3 touchdowns, also missing 1 game. Tragically, The most interesting tight end on the team this year only lasted 3.25 games before getting hurt and missing the rest of the season. Will Dissly, the rookie from University of Washington, hauled in 8 passes on 14 targets for 156 yards and 2 touchdowns before going down. Ultimately, no tight end on the 2018 Seattle Seahawks was able to break 300 receiving yards, and collectively, they could not break 600 yards. 2019 ended up being not much better. Ed Dickson was once again planned to be a featured part of the offense at tight end, but this time, instead of missing the first 6 games, he ended up missing all of them and never even taking the field. Despite this, it actually looked like the Seahawks had finally found their answer at the position in the form of Will Dissly, who was back from his injury and started the 2019 campaign off to a sizzling start. 23 receptions on 27 targets for 262 yards and 4 touchdowns in just the first 5 games of the season. Unfortunately, early in game number 6, he would get injured yet again and not make it back. With those 2 guys out of the picture, Jacob Hollister was forced into a starting role despite having only 8 career catches before the 2019 season and not being able to even make the Patriots practice squad. Hollister ended up posting 41 catches on 59 targets for 349 yards and 3 touchdowns. While it was an unremarkable season by most metrics, it has to be said that with 41 catches in the 2019 season, Jacob Hollister is the first non-Jimmy Graham tight end to top 40 catches in a single season at the tight end position for Russell Wilson. Oh yeah, do you guys remember Luke Willson? You guys might have noticed he wasn't there in 2018. Well, he was in Detroit, posting his career low in receptions and receiving yards, 13 for 87 in actuality. He was back. That's right, due to injuries, we brought Luke Willson back off the couch, and he posted 8 receptions on 10 targets for 79 yards. Russell Wilson has been a starting quarterback in the NFL for 8 years now, and he has still yet to play with a tight end who has gone over 70 receptions or 1,000 yards in a single season, which is certainly notable in the era of players such as Rob Gronkowski, Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, and George Kittle. However, more damning than even that for Wilson's slew of tight ends over the years is that he's never had multiple tight ends in a single season go for over 25 receptions or 300 receiving yards. Beyond even that, of the 9 players who appear on this list, 5 would go on to experience either season-ending injuries or career-ending injuries during their time as a Seahawk. Luckily, it seems like 2020 is going to be a different story for the Seahawks as they've assembled a tight end group that is both talented and deep for the first time in Wilson's career. How good is this tight end group? Let's try to estimate it. Here we have the 4 tight ends currently on the Seahawks who are likely to be on the active roster in 2020 who actually played professional football in 2019. Then I took their 2019 stats and averaged them out to a full 16-game season. By no means should anybody take this as a prediction. It would be pretty much impossible for any of these players, much less all 4, to reach these statistical milestones. But what this does a decent job of doing is measuring potential. First, we have Greg Olsen, who spent 2019 in Carolina and actually had a relatively healthy season, missing only 2 games thanks to a cheap shot that gave him a concussion. Had he played all 16 games, his stats project out to 62 catches on 97 targets for 708 yards and 2 touchdowns. And it must be noted that he played most of the season with Kyle Allen, the 30th ranked quarterback in the league by QBR. Next up, we have Will Dissly, who was off to an incredible start in 2019 before he got hurt in the 6th game. It's anybody's guess to if Will be able to stay healthy this year, but if you take his 2019 stats and average it out over 16 games, you come up with 70 catches on 82 targets for 798 yards and 12 touchdowns. Then we have Jacob Hollister, and yes, Seahawks fans, however you feel about it, expect Jacob to be on the active roster come 2020. He came in after Dissly got hurt and played the best that he could. All in all, if you take his numbers and average it out over 16 games, you'll come out to 60 receptions on 86 targets for 508 yards and 4 touchdowns. Lastly, we have Luke Willson, who will actually have his hands full making the team, much less the active roster. However, given the injury histories of some of the players in front of him, it's reasonable to expect that he's ultimately going to play a little bit for the 2020 Seahawks. If you take his stats from 2019 and average it out over a full season, you'll come to 16 receptions on 20 targets for 158 yards. Once again, these numbers do not constitute any kind of prediction at all. In fact, I seriously doubt any of these four players will come all that close to these statistical milestones. But it has to be said that for the first time in Wilson's career as a Seahawk, he actually has multiple tight ends who are capable of putting up very big numbers. And by the way, I didn't even mention Colby Parkinson, a fourth-round rookie from Stanford, who looks poised to make some kind of impact on the 2020 Seahawks. We're going to bring him up a little later. However, while, as we just established, the Seahawks are quite deep at tight end, they seem to be quite shallow at wide receiver. Don't get me wrong, they're pretty strong at the top, with Tyler Lockett coming off his career best season and DK Metcalf coming off a very strong rookie campaign. But past that, we just don't really see that much. The current number 3 wide receiver on the depth chart is Philip Dorsett, who came over from the Patriots last year, and even if you take his 2019 stat line and average it out over 16 games, you're left with something pretty lackluster. 33 receptions on 62 targets for 454 yards and 6 touchdowns. And then you have David Moore coming off a 2019 season where he flashed a little potential, but mostly didn't make big contributions. If you take his numbers and average it out over 16 games, you have 19 catches on 39 targets for 344 yards and 2 touchdowns. As for the rest of the Seattle Seahawks wide receiver depth chart, only one player actually has a catch in the NFL, John Ursua, who has 1. So, all this being the case, how can the 2020 Seahawks maximize the potential of their tight ends while minimizing the shallowness of their wide receivers? First, let's consider the possibility of multiple tight end formations. Is it feasible for an NFL team to use multiple tight ends on a majority of their plays? Well, in a word, yes. I took a look at the formations that every NFL team used during the 2019 season to try to get an idea of which teams were using multiple tight end formations the most. As it turns out, 2 teams use multiple tight end formations on more than half of their offensive snaps. The Philadelphia Eagles at 56% and the Minnesota Vikings at 54%. But what about the NFL's best offenses? Did they use a lot of multiple tight end formations? Mostly, yes. The 2019 Dallas Cowboys didn't. They only used multiple tight ends on 22% of their formations, on the way to being the number 1 team in the NFL in terms of yards. But the Baltimore Ravens, who led the league in points, used multiple tight ends on 41% of their plays. Also of note are the 49ers and Chiefs, the 2 teams that made the Super Bowl and 2 teams that had elite offenses through most of 2019. They both used multiple tight ends on exactly 33% of their offensive plays. One thing's for sure, though, all of these offenses used multiple tight ends way more than the 2019 Seahawks, who were closer to the bottom of the league in this stat at 16%. All in all, in 2019, NFL teams used multiple tight end formations about 28% of the time. Just for the sake of some context, I took a look at 2018 as well. This year, there were no NFL teams that used multiple tight end formations on more than half of their plays. In fact, I could only find 3 that used them on more than 40% of their plays. The Eagles and Titans both at 42%, and the Texans at 40%. As for the top NFL offenses, well, no matter how you slice it, the best offenses in the league in 2018 were the Chiefs and the Rams. The Chiefs did largely as they did in 2019. They used multiple tight ends on 32% of their plays. But of interesting note is the Rams, who ran multiple tight end sets on just 10% of their plays. So did we finally find a team that runs multiple tight end sets less than the Seahawks? Actually, yes. The 2018 Seahawks were well below the league average, running multiple tight end sets on only 14% of their snaps, but that did beat the Rams. All in all, the 2018 NFL lined up with multiple tight end sets on 24% of their plays. So clearly, 2019 saw an uptick in the usage of tight ends. Could this mean something? Is the NFL headed in another direction? We might need some more data to be sure of that, but it does seem like teams are more and more comfortable with using multiple tight ends. So clearly, NFL teams are fully capable of utilizing a lot of tight ends a lot of the time. But are the Seahawks going to actually do that? To try to help answer that, I took a look at the past of Brian Schottenheimer. I took a look at what he did in New York from 2006 to 2011, and then the Rams from 2012 to 2014. The final results were actually fairly promising. Several of Brian Schottenheimer's teams in New York and St. Louis actually had a tight end as their leading receiver. Dustin Keller did it a couple times with the Jets, Lance Kendrick and Jared Cooks did it a couple times on the Rams. And while the second tight end basically never caught any passes while Schottenheimer was a Jet, in St. Louis it was a little different. The last 2 years that Brian was the offensive coordinator for St. Louis, they experienced multiple tight ends having significant statistical impacts on their offense. So while my findings are that Brian Schottenheimer has never had a tight end room as deep as this, and he needs to prove that he knows how to use this many quality tight ends, it does seem like there is some stuff in his past that indicates that he might be able to pull it off. All this being said, while multiple tight end sets can be a significant part of the solution, it cannot be the whole solution if we're actually trying to minimize how often Seattle's wide receivers are on the field. So let's take a look at how our tight ends actually play. Let's start with Greg Olsen and take a look at his 2019 campaign. First, Greg Olsen would run a route on 89% of Carolina Panthers passing plays that he was actually on the field for, a pretty high number that is in line with most of the elite pass-catching tight ends in the NFL. So where did Greg Olsen like to line up? Well, the answer is kind of sort of all over the place. Yes, he usually lined up tight, which is where you would usually find a tight end. 52% of his snaps and 25 of his receptions were done from the tight set, but he also lined up in the slot about 42% of the time, and 27 of his receptions came from the slot. This is where you can get a little creative to get more tight ends on the field without actually having them line up tight. He also lined up in the backfield and on the outside insignificant number of times and failed to record a single reception from either location, but this gives an indication of how you can get tight ends on the field without necessarily running multiple tight end sets. Lining up in the slot is actually quite common for a prolific pass-catching tight end. You'll find that guys such as Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, and George Kittle did so quite a bit in 2019 as well. Next, let's take a look at Will Dissly and his 2019. He would run a route on 85% of passing plays, which makes sense given how good of a blocker he is and also how good of a pass catcher he has proven to be. He would usually line up tight 73% of the time, and 14 of his 23 receptions came when he was lined up tight. He would occasionally line up in the slot 21% of the time, making 7 catches from this position, but it's tough to deny that Will Dissly plays like a traditional tight end most of the time. Dissly also lined up outside on a small but not entirely insignificant 5% of his snaps, recording 2 receptions for 11 yards. Next up, we have Jacob Hollister, who actually started at tight end for the Seahawks for most of the season, who ran routes on 87% of his passing snaps. Where did Hollister usually line up? Well, he lined up tight on about 51% of his snaps, making 23 of his receptions from there. He did line up in the slot almost 30% of the time, making 16 catches from the slot, and that's really about it. He lined up on the outside 3% of the time, making 2 catches, and 1% of the time lined up in the backfield. I know these numbers don't add up to 100%. Chalk it up to special teams. Finally, let's take a look at Luke Willson. In 2019, Luke only ran a route on 67% of passing plays that he was on the field for, indicating that we decided to use him in a decidedly different manner than most NFL tight ends. When he did line up, it was almost always tight, 72% of the time, and 6 of his 8 receptions came when he was lined up tight. Slot 5.8 and outside 4.4, 1 reception from each position, and a couple of lineups in the backfield resulted in no catches. Clearly, Luke Willson is a very specific type of tight end at this point in his career, and that is the kind of tight end who needs to line up tight. So we can actually see a decent amount of versatility in the Seahawks tight end room. We have 2 tight ends who line up in the slot frequently, and 2 tight ends who really like to line up tight on a majority of their snaps. This should allow for creative uses of them and hopefully being able to get them on the field frequently. Unfortunately, I do see one issue with this arrangement, and in order to explore it, we have to go back to looking at the Seahawks wide receivers. I wanted to see where the Seahawks wide receivers like to line up, just so I could compare it to how our tight ends like to line up to see if anything meshed. And to my surprise, when I examined Tyler Lockett's 2019, I found something that I didn't expect. Lockett lined up in the slot on 2/3 of his snaps roughly and made 70 of his receptions from the slot. He only lined up on the outside less than 17% of the time and made only 7 receptions lining up outside the whole year. As for DK Metcalf, well, he was a rookie in 2019, and the coaching staff has already said they're going to move him around a lot in 2020. So I don't know how meaningful these numbers are when we're trying to project 2020. But nevertheless, DK did line up on the outside on a majority of his snaps, 65.5%, and he made 47 catches when he was lined up outside. He did occasionally line up in the slot, 22.8% of the time, and 11 of his catches, and he lined up tight and in the backfield on about 1% combined of his snaps. Now, in fairness, Philip Dorsett and David Moore, the other two Seahawks wide receivers with any kind of real NFL experience, both usually line up on the outside. Dorsett lines up on the outside 61% of the time, and David Moore at over 53%. However, the point of this exercise was to try to kind of keep those guys off the field. So we kind of have an issue here. The slot is getting a little crowded. Given that Tyler Lockett just had the first 1,000-yard season of his career and almost all of his production came from the slot, we really don't want to move him out of there since that seems to be where he's most comfortable and has his best production. But what does that mean for our tight ends? Currently, the Seahawks only have one particularly good wide receiver on the roster who usually lines up on the outside. So, in the spirit of being creative, I wanted to see if maybe we could use a tight end to fill that gap. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like any of the veteran tight ends on the Seahawks roster are going to be able to do it. Of the four, the only one who played more than 5% of his snaps outside was Will Dissly, who came in at a not exactly confidence-inducing 5.2%. This got me curious, so I decided to take a look at the whole NFL. I looked at every single tight end who played in 2019 and how often they lined up at outside receiver. As it turns out, while tight ends line up in the slot all the time, it's quite rare for them to actually line up on the outside. My research was able to find exactly 4 tight ends who lined up at outside wide receiver at least 50 times in the 2019 regular season. 4th place went to Tyler Eifert of the Bengals, who did so 57 times, or on 11.6 of his snaps. The bronze medal went to Jordan Atkins of the Texans, who lined up outside on 68 snaps, or 10.5% of his snaps. 2nd place, and the only truly prolific receiving tight end who made this list, is Darren Waller of the Raiders. He lined up wide on 85 snaps in 2019, also 9.2% of his snaps. And 1st place, that went to Gerald Everett of the Los Angeles Rams. He lined up outside on 88 snaps. His 20% of snaps taken as an outside receiver was also by far the highest count of any tight end I could find. This is actually despite the fact that Gerald Everett missed 3 games in 2019. Had he played in all 16 games, it seems very likely that he would have broken 100 snaps lined up as an outside receiver. All told, the Rams lined up Gerald Everett as an outside receiver on about 7 snaps a game on average. A not huge, but definitely not insignificant number. So ultimately, lining up a tight end outside is pretty rare in the NFL right now. However, it does happen. The question is, can the Seahawks do it this year with their tight ends? It doesn't seem very likely with their current crop of veteran tight ends. However, this is why I told you earlier to keep Colby Parkinson in mind. We're going to be taking a look at him and how the Seahawks might use him in 2020. Unfortunately, I don't have any data on where Stanford liked to line up Colby Parkinson when he was part of their offense, so we're going to do the next best thing and take a look at some tape. Lacking the ability to watch every single game that Stanford played in 2019, I instead decided to try to find the best Colby Parkinson highlight video that I could and study it for relevant information. My first resource was a video by Just Bombs Production, a highlight reel YouTube channel that I will be crediting and linking in the description. Their highlight video of Colby Parkinson goes through 14 of the best plays that Colby had at Stanford, including all 12 of his career touchdowns. I took a screenshot of each play right before or right at the snap to see where Colby was lining up. While this method does leave off hundreds of snaps that would be useful for this study, it does give you a good idea of where Colby Parkinson tends to line up on plays where he actually makes a big play. Remember, 12 of these 14 plays ended in touchdowns, and the other 2 in long receptions. Now then, let's take a look at these 14 screenshots and analyze where Colby lined up.
On play number 1, Colby lines up just outside the numbers on the right side of the offensive formation. On play number 2, you can't actually see Colby in the initial pre-snap shot, but he is lined up outside the numbers at the top on the right side of the offense once again. On play number 3, Colby lines up just inside the numbers, and this time on the left side of the formation, but he's still the outside-most receiver on the play. Play number 4, which happens right near the goal line, sees Colby line up on the left side again, this time outside the numbers, most certainly an outside receiver. Play number 5 sees Colby line up on the left side, outside the hash, but inside the numbers. Nevertheless, when you look at the formation, you can pretty clearly see he's intended to be the outside receiver in this formation. On play number 6, you can't really see Colby because once again the pre-snap shot cuts him off, but you can just barely see his foot lined up outside the numbers on the left side of the offense. Once again, the outside receiver. Play number 7 sees Colby line up basically on the numbers on the right side of the formation. Once again, for the 7th play in a row, we see Colby line up as basically an outside wide receiver. On play number 8, we get a little variety. Here, Colby lines up in the slot on the right side of the offense with a receiver to his outside. Play number 9 sees Colby once again in the slot, this time on the left side of the offense, with an outside receiver to his left. On play number 10, which finds Stanford once again near the goal line, Colby lines up on the right side of the formation with no outside receiver to his right. Here we have another goal line situation for Stanford, 3rd and goal to be precise, and Stanford lines up with 3 wideouts. However, Colby doesn't line up in the slot. He's actually on the left side by himself as the outside receiver. Play number 12 is the first play we've looked at so far that didn't end in a Colby Parkinson touchdown. This one ends in a completion of about 20 yards. Anyway, Colby's lined up in the slot this time, and so far this is by far the closest we've actually seen him to the offensive line in any of these formations. Play number 13, unfortunately, cuts off the entire top half of the field in the pre-snap shot, so we can't see exactly where Colby is lined up, but he is lined up in the slot on the left side with a receiver to his outside. And our final play in this video, and the second play that doesn't result in a Colby touchdown, we see him on the right side lined up pretty darn close to the offensive line, but not aligned with them at pre-snap. It might be a small sample size, but it has to be remembered that these 14 plays are quite possibly the best 14 plays that Colby had while he was at Stanford for 3 years, and we found 9 plays where he lined up as an outside receiver, compared to 5 where he was in the slot, and a grand total of 0 where he was lined up tight with the offensive line. I did take a look at a couple other Colby Parkinson videos to see if those videos could confirm what I saw in this one, and generally speaking, yes. Colby usually lines up as a wide receiver and quite often lines up on the outside on plays where he's actually involved as a pass catcher. So maybe this is the solution for the 2020 Seahawks offense. This is how we can get Colby Parkinson on the field as a rookie while still allowing the rest of our tight ends to get their fair shake in the offense as well. This also reduces the load on a guy like David Moore and Philip Dorsett and allows them to only play maybe 30 to 40% of the snaps if we decide to use Parkinson frequently as an outside receiver. Even if we only use Colby Parkinson on 5 or 6 plays a game as an outside receiver, that's actually a fairly significant chunk of a game. Remember, most NFL offenses run about 60 to 70 plays per game. One thing's for sure, though. This strategy would allow Colby Parkinson to contribute significantly as a rookie while not getting in the way of the playing time of players such as Greg Olsen, Will Dissly, Jacob Hollister, and also allow Tyler Lockett to remain in the slot on a vast majority of his snaps. The 2020 Seattle Seahawks have an interesting depth chart at both tight end and wide receiver, and making it work well is going to take some degree of creativity. This video explored one way in which the offense could do that while still being a dangerous threat for any NFL defense. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of the Seattle Seahawks tight end room going into 2020, and I hope you learned something interesting on the way. Thank you.